My name is Dana Kelce. I'm 41 years old, and I've managed multi-million-dollar accounts without once losing my composure. I've talked down a client who was ready to pull a 7-figure contract because someone shipped the wrong color samples on a Tuesday. I don't rattle. So when my sister-in-law, Renata, pulled me aside at my own nephew's birthday party, in front of my husband, in front of the neighbors, in front of a woman I'd never met, and said, loud enough to cut through the backyard noise, I told corporate what you really are, Dana. I told them you're not stable. I told them about the breakdown. You'll be lucky if you still have a job by Friday. I didn't spill my drink. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at her and said, thank you for telling me. And then I went inside, picked up my phone, and started a clock. 6 months later, Renata sat across from me in a human resources conference room, and the folder on the table between us had her name on it. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet women deal with loud cruelty, and the truth takes its time, but it never, ever misses. If you believe in a justice that doesn't need an audience, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because we're just getting started. Let me back up, because before the birthday party, there was a promotion. I'd been with Callaway and Marsh, a regional marketing firm with 4 offices and about 300 employees, for 11 years. I'd started as a junior account coordinator straight out of grad school, and I'd worked my way up to senior account director, the kind of title that takes a decade and a few 160-hour weeks to earn. There was one more step above me, VP of Client Strategy. When our VP, Martin Orr, announced he was retiring at the end of the fiscal year, my name was the first one that came up. My manager said it directly. The partners said it directly. I was the internal frontrunner, and I knew it. I was also married to Renata's brother. My husband, Greg Kelce, is a good man, a genuinely good man, steady, kind, the kind of father who remembers what his kids say they want to be when they grow up, and asks about it 6 months later. We'd been married 12 years, but Greg's family was complicated in the way that some families are complicated, not with cruelty you could point to, but with an unspoken hierarchy, a pecking order no one admitted existed. And at the top of that order was Renata. Dana Kelce, she'd kept the last name even after 2 marriages, was 46 and had made a career out of knowing people. She networked the way other people breathed, constantly, reflexively, and always for leverage. She sat on 2 nonprofit boards. She volunteered at her kids' school in a way that ensured she was always the one the principal called first. She was charming in the way that functions as a warning sign once you know what to look for. She'd never liked me. I want to be precise about that, because it matters to the story. It wasn't that we'd fought, or that I'd done something to her. She just didn't like that there was a woman in her family's circle who didn't need her, and for 11 years, I'd been too busy building something real to notice just how far her reach had grown. The promotion process officially began in January. Internal interviews, a presentation to the partner group, a 90-day review period. I prepared the way I prepare for everything, methodically, completely, without a single corner cut. In February, Greg mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd run into his sister at the gym and she'd been asking about my job, specifically about the VP track. He said she seemed interested, which didn't strike him as strange because Renata always seemed interested in everything. It struck me a little strangely, but I filed it and moved on. In March, I gave the partner presentation. It went well. I knew it went well the way you know some things in your body before your brain has time to argue. The partners asked good questions. I had good answers. One of them, a woman named Cheryl Bastian, who had been with the firm since before I was born, held my eye contact a beat longer than necessary when she shook my hand at the end. That night I cooked dinner, and Greg opened a bottle of wine, and we talked about the kids' spring schedules, and it was a completely normal evening. I remember that specifically, how normal it was. The following week, I noticed something shift. It was small at first. My manager, Phil, had a way of stopping by my office in the mornings, coffee in hand, quick check-in, nothing formal. He'd done it for years. That week, he didn't stop by. The week after, same. When I passed him in the hallway, he was warm, professional. But the easy rhythm we'd had was suddenly just slightly off. I told myself I was imagining it, overanalyzing the way people in the middle of career pivots tend to do. Then in April, a colleague named Brianna, we weren't close, but we were friendly, passed me in the break room and said, unprompted, "Hey, I just want you to know I don't believe any of it." I stopped. Believe any of what? She looked uncomfortable immediately, the way people do when they realize they've handed someone a piece of information they weren't supposed to have. She backpedaled. "Oh, nothing. Forget I said it. Honestly, it's nothing," and left the room quickly. I stood there with my coffee going cold. I didn't chase her down. I didn't panic. I went back to my desk, and I sat very still for about 3 minutes, the way I do when a situation requires thinking rather than reacting. And then I started paying attention in a different way. Within 2 weeks, I had a shape. I couldn't see the whole picture, but I could see a shape. Certain people were careful with me in a way they hadn't been before. The kind of careful that means they know something about you that you don't know they know. A newer employee on my team seemed surprised, actually surprised, when I handled a difficult client call calmly and professionally, like she'd been expecting something else. And then came the birthday party. My nephew Caden turned 9 in early May. We hosted at our house, backyard, a bounce house, 30 kids, all the chaos. Renata came with her 2 boys and her current husband, a quiet man named Derek who seemed to exist primarily to nod at things Renata said. She waited until there were people nearby. That part was deliberate. I know that now. She waited until Greg's mother was within earshot, and a neighbor couple I'd known for 4 years, and a woman I'd never seen before who I later found out worked in Renata's office. And then she delivered her little speech about instability, about a breakdown, about my job being in danger by Friday. I said, "Thank you for telling me, because here's what happened in my body in that moment." Calm. Not the fake, performed calm of someone holding something down. Actual calm, because something that had been shapeless just got a shape, and I always work better with something concrete in front of me. I went inside. I texted Phil and asked if we could meet Monday morning. Then I called a woman I trusted, an employment attorney named Gail Strom, who I'd used 2 years earlier for a contractor dispute. I didn't explain the whole thing. I just said, I need to know what it looks like when someone makes false statements about an employee to their employer. I need to know what my options are. Gail said, "Send me what you have." I didn't have much yet, but I was about to start collecting. Monday morning, Phil sat across from me in his office and was so professionally careful that he might as well have been wearing a sign. I'd known this man for 11 years. I knew the difference between Phil being neutral and Phil being coached to be neutral. I kept my voice easy and warm. I told him I'd heard some things were being said about me, and I wanted to address them directly. I asked if there was anything he needed to ask me, anything he'd heard that he'd like me to respond to. The pause before he answered lasted about 2 seconds too long. He said there was nothing formal, that everything was fine, that the process was ongoing. He smiled the way people smile when they're managing you. I thanked him and left. That night I wrote down everything I could remember. Dates, comments, the shift in Phil's behavior, Brianna's comment, the new employee's reaction on the call, Renata's exact words at the party, with the names of the 4 people who'd been standing close enough to hear them. I wrote it out in a plain document, time-stamped it, and emailed it to myself and to Gail. Gail called me 2 days later. She'd done some thinking. If someone made false statements to your employer about your mental health, statements that aren't grounded in any medical record or documented incident, and if those statements influenced an employment decision, you're looking at potentially defamation, and depending on the nature of the statements, possibly an ADA-adjacent claim around perceived disability. The key word is false. Can you prove it's false? I said, I've never had a breakdown. I've never been treated for anything. There's no record because there's nothing to record. Then they have a problem, she said, because they'd have to prove the statement was true, and they can't. But I told Gail I wasn't ready to move yet. I wanted more. I wanted it clean and complete, not reactive. She said she understood. She said, build your file. I built my file. Over the next 8 weeks, I was meticulous in a way that felt almost meditative. I documented every interaction. I followed up every verbal conversation with a brief email, just confirming what we discussed, which created a paper record of things that might otherwise disappear. I noted every meeting I was excluded from that I should have been in. I noted every time my input was solicited and then not acted on in ways that were a departure from the previous pattern. In early June, the VP position was posted internally for a second round. They said they wanted to expand the candidate pool. That was the language they used. Expand the candidate pool. It was posted with a new set of criteria that hadn't been in the original posting, including a line about demonstrated stability in high-pressure stakeholder environments, unquote. I read that line 3 times. Stability. I saved a screenshot. I sent it to Gail. She called me within the hour. That language is new? She asked. It wasn't in the January posting, I said. Okay, she said. That's something. In July, I had lunch with Brianna. It had taken 6 weeks of patient, low-pressure contact for her to relax enough around me to talk. I didn't push her. I let her steer, and about halfway through a salad she hadn't really been eating, she told me someone had called HR. An outside call, not an employee. The caller had said they were a former colleague of mine from a job I'd held before Callaway and Marsh, and that they were concerned about my mental health history. They'd mentioned a specific incident, a breakdown at a conference, that had apparently required medical intervention. That incident had never happened, but someone had invented it in enough detail that it had been noted. Not formally investigated, apparently, not brought to me, just noted, and the note had traveled. I kept eating my lunch. I kept my voice even. Do you know who called? I asked. Brianna shook her head. I just heard it was a woman. I thanked her. I picked up the check. And walking back to the office in the July heat, I thought about Renata's face at the birthday party. How certain she'd looked. How she'd wanted me to see her doing it. She hadn't been subtle because she hadn't needed to be, or so she'd thought. She'd operated in a world her whole life where the things she said had gone unchallenged because the people she said them about either didn't know, didn't fight, or couldn't prove it. She had miscalculated, badly, by choosing someone who documents everything. In August, I filed a formal complaint with HR. I want to be clear about what I filed and why, because this part matters. I didn't file out of anger. Anger is a terrible legal strategy and an even worse professional one. I filed because I had a clear, documented case that false statements had been made about my mental health to my employer, that those statements were materially false, and that they had directly affected a promotional process I had been the frontrunner for. I had dates, I had witnesses, I had the changed job posting with its new language. I had Brianna's account. I had Renata's own words, delivered in front of 4 witnesses at a backyard birthday party. I had built a file that could stand up in a room. HR's initial response was careful and non-committal, which I'd expected. They said they would investigate. They assigned a case manager I'd never met. I thanked them and said I looked forward to the process. I also, that same week, sent a certified letter through Gail to Renata directly. It was not aggressive. It was not emotional. It outlined, in plain language, the nature of the false statements, the identifiable harm to my professional standing, and the documentation I held. It said, without any ambiguity, that if the matter was not resolved through proper internal channels, we were prepared to pursue it externally. Greg knew by then. I'd told him the night before I filed, calmly, completely, giving him the full picture. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to believe me." He said, "I do." That was enough. Renata, to her credit, did not stay quiet. She called Greg. She called their mother. She told them I was attacking her, that I was using my lawyer to intimidate family, that this was exactly the kind of instability she'd been trying to warn people about. She was loud and certain, and she wept on the phone, which she was good at. But here was the thing about Renata's version of events. It required everyone around her to not look too closely. And a formal HR investigation is, by design, exactly the act of looking closely. The case manager, a measured woman named Patricia Hollis, interviewed 8 people over 4 weeks. I found out later she'd been doing HR investigations for 19 years. She asked precise questions in a neutral voice and wrote everything down. And she had a particular talent, Brianna told me afterward, for asking the same question in slightly different ways until the answers started to diverge. In late September, Patricia scheduled a meeting. Renata was there. Her personal HR representative was there. Phil was there. Cheryl Bastian, the partner, was there. Gail was there with me. I wore a gray blazer I'd had for 6 years. I'd stitched a button back on it the night before. I drank the coffee someone put in front of me, and I kept my hands still. Patricia opened the folder. The investigation had found, in Patricia's careful language, that an outside caller had contacted HR in March using a false identity, claiming to be a former colleague of mine at a company where no such person was on record. The call had been traced back to a phone number registered to a business address associated with one of Renata's board memberships. The described incident, the breakdown at a conference, had been corroborated by no one, contradicted by multiple colleagues who had been at that conference and appeared in no documentation of any kind. Patricia looked up from the folder. She looked at Renata. Renata was very still. Patricia continued. The VP posting criteria had been amended in a way that was not standard process and had not been approved by the partner group. That amendment was being reviewed separately. The candidate process was being formally reopened. Then she closed the folder. She did not say Renata's name out loud in connection with the false call. She didn't need to. The phone number was in the file. Everyone in the room could read. I want to tell you how it ended. But first I want to tell you what it felt like in that room, because the feeling is the part people in these stories don't always describe. It didn't feel like winning. Winning is a sports word. It implies a score, a moment where everything snaps to one side. This was quieter than that. It felt like something being corrected, like a sentence that had been wrong for 7 months, finally being read back accurately. The relief of it was enormous and completely private. I didn't look at Renata. I didn't need to. The VP process was formally reopened in October. I resubmitted. In November, Cheryl Bastian called me into her office and offered me the position. I accepted it. Renata resigned from the nonprofit board, whose address had appeared in the investigation. She and Greg had a long, difficult series of conversations that I was not part of and did not ask about. Greg's relationship with his sister did not end, but it changed, in ways that are theirs, not mine, to define. We don't see her much anymore. The colleague who'd been hired instead of me during the tainted process, a perfectly decent man named Alan who had done nothing wrong, was offered a senior role that was, in truth, a better fit for him. He took it without complaint. He and I have worked well together since. Gail sent me a final invoice and a handwritten note that said simply, "Nice work." I put it in my desk drawer. And I want to say this to anyone watching who is in the middle of something like this, who is swallowing a lie about themselves to keep the peace, to keep a job, to keep a family from fracturing, to keep being liked. The silence you're keeping is not free. Someone is spending it. They are spending your reputation, your career, your name, and they are counting on you to stay quiet, because quiet is cheaper than the truth. When the truth isn't yours to carry, you don't have to be loud. I never raised my voice once through this entire thing, but you do have to be precise. Document everything. Date everything. Send the follow-up email. Find the Gail Strom in your city. Build the file. The truth doesn't need noise. It needs a record. That's Dana Kelce's story. Or part of it, anyway. The VP title comes with a lot of early mornings and a lot of late calls, and one very good parking spot that I will not pretend isn't satisfying. The gray blazer with the restitched button hangs in my office now. I wear it on the days when something needs to be said carefully. If this story hit you somewhere real, if you've been the person standing in a backyard holding your composure while someone tries to take something that belongs to you, drop a comment. I want to know where you're watching from and what you're carrying. You don't have to say the whole thing. Just say here if you're here. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if quiet justice is your kind of story, and I'll see you in the next one. The truth takes its time, but it never misses.